Welcome back to Title Talk at Title Leap, and this week we are talking about what to do when buyers fail to perform. They fail to come to the closing table, they fail to close, all that good stuff.
I'm David Velez, closer extraordinaire and Chief Development Officer of Title Leap.
And I'm Jim Brown, a Florida real estate attorney at James Brown Law and founder of Title Leap.
So, you're at closing. Buyer doesn't perform, they can't close for whatever reason. What is the seller to do?
So, the very first thing you want to tell your seller to do is you get rumor that the buyer may not perform. You want to make sure you send that critical email that the seller is ready, willing, and able to close. You copy all the parties and you tell them you demand the closing documents nicely. Not a real formal, heavy demand. You want all the closing documents. You want to know the time and the place of closing, and you want and here's the wiring instructions where they can send your money after the closing.
So essentially you want to take all those steps as if you are going to close, essentially. You're a seller,
Exactly.
Have my docs ready, I'm going to sign them.
Yep.
Here's my wiring information for my proceeds. I've done everything I can
I'm
to...
closing remotely, send them over, whatever it is. Yep,
Okay.
you want to line it all up.
And so...
regardless of what you hear may be going on the buyer's side. So the fact pattern I see from many realtors is they call me and they say, we didn't do anything. Okay. And everybody knew the buyer wasn't going to close. That's not a great setup. You want to set this thing up for your maximum seller success. You want to do all those things you just said. You want to make the title agent, everybody in the transaction well aware, seller's ready to go.
Okay, so seller does all that and buyer doesn't perform. Now what?
So the next day after the closing fails to occur, you want to send a cancellation letter signed by your seller saying the deal is closed, that the deposits should go promptly to the seller, all the deposits should go to the seller, and then send that immediately to the buyer. Again, I see so many times realtors say everybody knew they weren't going to close,
Right.
Regardless of what the issue is, a lender issue, an inspection issue, it's not the seller's problem.
Right.
The best thing for the realtor on the seller's side to do is set this thing up so it looks like seller, like I said, ready, willing, and able, buyer didn't perform.
Okay.
Send the cancellation over, and then we're going to talk about what to do in part 2 of the next title talk.
Okay. So,
what to do next?
What to do next? So, what if the buyer doesn't sign the cancellation? Does the seller still have to keep that property open? Can they relist? Or?
That's all part 2 stuff, but there's one thing I did want to go over.
Okay.
There was a rule that you brought up the other day regarding the CFPB in paragraph 5.
Right, that's right. Okay, so the buyer can't close, but it's not really because the buyer doesn't want to close.
Right, so those are third-party failures.
Yeah, third-party failures. The lender, didn't do their 3-day trade requirement things, as sometimes they miss or whatever.
Right.
So what happens there?
So if you have a buyer's failure because the lender failed to disclose the CD in a timely manner with the days required, then provision 5 of the standard FAR-BAR agreement, just the FAR-BAR, not the Realtors Association agreement, but just the FAR-BAR, says that the closing date will be extended the number of days to accommodate that CFPB failure. And there's a limit, I think it's a week or something.
Right.
And every agent should read that paragraph over and over because it does come up. It came up a couple times in the last several weeks. And it will allow the buyer to close after the closing date. Obviously, the proceeds, we would all agree, the prorations should be as of the day of the original contemplated closing.
Right.
But it's not stipulated, I don't believe it's stipulated in the contract as to where the prorations should occur.
It's very vague. It just says, shall not exceed 10 days. And
10 days is the limit of the extension. That's a long time.
Yeah, and it's such a period to satisfy CFPB requirements. So,
and I would argue that if the seller's willing and able to perform on Monday and there was a CFPB failure and it would be extended, that the prorations should be as of the originally scheduled date.
So you would freeze the prorations to the day of closing.
But it's not stipulated in the contract, so that's open for interpretation.
Right.
So I would that would be an issue that, as a good agent, you would want to lobby in favor of your seller that the prorations should be on the day of the originally scheduled closing.
It almost seems to me that, like, the buyer is reasonable and their agent's being reasonable, and it's because of the loan that it was being delayed. That they would probably agree to do so.
It does say that the closing date shall be extended for such a period to satisfy CFPB, which would, and if you notice in the contract, it's capital C, capital D, so they are talking about the actual closing date. So then that would lead me to believe that the prorations will be in favor of the buyer.
So I should follow the closing date as the
Yeah,
contract
but
stipulates.
I don't like that. It's definitely not well stipulated, and I can see arguments for both sides.
Yeah.
Long and the short of it is, your buyer can't close. The seller should take all affirmative steps to make that closing look like it's going to happen.
Right.
Put the burden on the buyer to come back and say, no, because of this.
Right.
But don't assume, this is the mistake I see over and over, agents assume because it's so obvious, the buyer didn't get their loan together, the buyer didn't get whatever was necessary together, but they're not going to do anything. That's not the stance you want to take. And if you do have a closing that does fail to occur and you want to get this issue forced and you're having a hard time, give us a call. We can absolutely help.
Yep, absolutely. We deal with this sort of thing all the time. And
fortunately or unfortunately.
Exactly. So if you ever have any issues like this, feel free to give us a call.
And subscribe and stay tuned to next week for more Title Talk. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Talking about soul.